And there comes a point where it's like, no, this guy really believes this. Okay? And then we have to ask the question, like, okay, if Paul went through all this, and we can prove historically that, then it's like, well, we know Peter got executed, and we know that Peter and the apostles, we know from Polycarp that Peter and the apostles experienced some sort of violent persecution. So where do we go next? Probably it was a thing. I mean, First Peter, it is contested about whether or not Peter wrote it, but in general, it goes way back, and it talks about Christians enduring violent persecution. That's what the whole context of the book is about. So, like, and then even the Gospel John records for us, is actually our oldest source for Peter's martyrdom. It says, it has Jesus predicting Peter's martyrdom. Okay? And some people think that it was probably written, about 25 years after Peter died, but like, either way, it's actually the earliest source. We may have another source. We have a source, First Clement, that talks about Peter and Paul being executed, and if they were executed in Rome, then, like, again, they're lifted up as examples, and that brings me to my next point. This concept of endurance, Paul uses it in 1 Thessalonians. Polycarp's talking about it. I mean, like let's go back to Polycarp here. Polycarp to the Philippians 8:1. Therefore, let us therefore without ceasing hold fast by our hope and by the earnestness of our righteousness, which is Jesus Christ, who took up our sins in his own body on the tree, who did no sin, neither was guile found in his mouth, but for our sakes he endured all things, that we might live in him. Let us therefore become imitators of his endurance. Alright, same thing in 1 Thessalonians. 1 Thessalonians 1. Okay? Again, the same idea. Right in his opening, we thank God for all of you and continually mention your prayers. We remember before our God and Father your work produced by faith, your labor prompted by love, and your endurance inspired by hope in our Lord Jesus Christ. Right? You became imitators of us and the Lord, for you welcomed the message in the midst of severe sufferings with the joy given by the Holy Spirit. He goes on and on about this. You got to keep reading this book. Okay? And we wait for the Son of God from heaven, whom God raised from the dead, Jesus, who rescues us from the coming wrath. Okay, so endurance. Well, I mean, what did Christ endure? Why do they keep using this endurance language? Endurance is like putting up with something that you can quit anytime you want. Like, you're an endurance athlete, you can just stop running and lay on the ground or sit on the ground or whatever it is and just chill and take a break. The whole point of endurance is that you keep going when you could stop. And certainly Christ didn't have to endure the cross. He didn't have to come here at all. He put up with it for our sakes. And if we imitate that, that means that these guys, that fits very well. And that becomes a piece of evidence for not just that they, got killed one time, but really for Christian martyrdom. We've got the Emperor Trajan writing correspondence letters to one of his governors named Pliny, and the question of how to deal with Christians comes up, and like the issue that they're concerned about is that people will accuse other people of being Christians so they can get them killed and get rid of people they don't like by falsely accusing them of being Christians. And so Pliny's method of dealing with it that Trajan approves of, the Emperor Trajan approves of, is just, hey, if they say they're not a Christian at the trial, then they're not a Christian. And they swear allegiance to the Roman gods, then they're not a Christian, and that's that, and we let them go. Why did Romans kill Christians? Okay, there's a few reasons. Later on, you get to the persecutions of Decius, towards the end of the 200s, and his whole thing is like, all right, the gods are angry with us for allowing Christianity to be such a big thing, and like, then you have the great persecution that comes after that, and it's like a lot of Christians executed. This is when you get lots of Christians executed. So that's why they're doing it at that point. And the whole idea is that you got to stop being Christian and follow the other religion. So, like, again, that's the idea. Sometimes Christians were persecuted just for having meetings, because we know the Roman government didn't. I don't know the exact number, but I think it's like 70% of emperors. The reason they stopped being the emperor, their reign ended, was because they were assassinated. So for rational reasons, they were afraid of political movements, and so they tended to be afraid of. In fact, I think Trajan, writing to Pliny about this, says this. It's like, they said that people over here in this province wanted to have a volunteer fire department. That's what they said. And Trajan writes back, oh, nope, request denied. For when people meet, no matter how innocent the reason, it ends up being a political group. They end up just arguing about politics. Doesn't that sound familiar? But he's concerned about that because they argue about politics, it becomes a political group, he gets executed, he gets assassinated, So like, that's one reason that the Romans persecuted the cult of Isis, the cult of Bacchus, the other religious groups, and probably Christians too. But one of the main reasons that kept coming up was it was illegal not to make sacrifices to the Roman gods. So this is the main reason that Christians were executed, for the crime it was a crime called atheism, where you refuse to honor the Roman gods, and specifically the emperor, as God, and you wouldn't make sacrifices and show and praise and worship the gods. Then and they had an imperial cult of like their different gods, imperial court, but like. And different emperor gods. If they die, they're emperor, and some of them would be emperors while they're still alive, And then they'd be worshipped on the other side of the empire, not on this side, But like, it made people mad when you started letting people worship you in your face. That actually didn't go over well. But like, it was a crime. So, and we know Christians, this was an issue because Paul writes very clearly, like to the church in Rome, about meat sacrificed to idols. That's what he's talking about. Like, the way it worked is people went and sacrificed meat to those idols, and like, they believed that the god would come inhabit the statue, and you would have a ceremony where you would open the mouth and nose, and the god would inhabit it, and then you'd come give food to the god, because even though the Roman and Greek gods were immortal, unlike the Germanic and Scandinavian and Babylonian gods, and I think Egyptian gods were not. The Roman gods and the Greek gods would have been immortal, but they got hungry. And so you go give them food, and then, they would, if the gods are pleased, then your land would make many crops, and your women would have many babies, and and the important gods were the war gods, right? The one you win in war, then you can enslave people over here and make them do all the work, and you'd be rich, and that was, the idea. They were literally giving the gods food, and then the gods would be like, "Oh, this is nice. I like this. Okay, I'm gonna do good things for you." But they were also concerned that if you didn't make sacrifices to the gods, that the gods would be angered and would bring destruction and terrible calamity and harm upon your city, upon your people, and even your nation and your empire. So, it was actually it was against the law not to do this. The Romans and I won't go into the evidence for this, but the Jews had a loophole within the Roman Empire. The Romans respected the right of Jews not to make sacrifices because their religion was old, and so that made it okay. But the issue arose when Christianity started converting former Gentiles to this Christian faith. So they didn't get the Jewish loophole, and so they were still supposed to make sacrifices to the gods. And that's where this controversy comes in. A lot of times people just got away without doing it, but like every once in a while people would get mad about it and it would be a thing. Okay, so that tended to be the issue. In Nero's case, he seemed to... We don't know exactly why Nero, had these Christians executed. We know Tacitus tells us that it was to blame... he has a view that he likes where it was Nero destroyed a bunch of the city and wanted to blame it on Christians. And we don't know that he was really in a position to know that or not, and it's just his speculation. But he tends to make it clear when he is speculating. And that wouldn't have been a matter of official Roman record anyway, that's why he did that. But I don't see why it would have been. Maybe I need to research it some more. But the point is, what is the point? I've lost my train of thought here. The apostles were executed for their faith. Nero. Oh, why did the Romans execute these Christians? So Paul is he writes about meat sacrifice to idols. So the way it works is somebody would go make a sacrifice to the gods, and then most of the time they'd sell it in the marketplace, and that would fund the temple. So you had to go buy that meat. So when Paul talks about food sacrifice to idols, it's an act of worship for you to go buy that meat and eat it because you're funding the temple. Okay, so I guess the gods didn't need all the meat that got sacrificed, but you had to fund the temple, and they would lay out the fancy meal for the gods. These ancient temples, they had it all, man. Even in ancient Babylon, Egypt, the gods had it all. They had different apartments in their temples. It was literally a house for the god. They had, swimming pools, and they would come out and bathe the idol and change his clothes. And the idols had social lives where they would have little mobile temples, and they would take them to to go visit the other gods at the other god house. They would bring the food out for them. The people would play the music for them. Everybody that lived there and worked there wasn't dealing with the people. They were just doing stuff for the god. They had spare rooms for when their other gods would come visit, and they'd have the little idol and oh, where's the idol of, Marduk? Oh, it's over. It's not in Babylon today. This month. And they had a regular schedule when they would, they kept up their little social life schedule. It's this time of year you gotta go visit that. And then they had different idols in different cities that would be repeated. But then the mighty one, like Ephesus, mighty Ephesus had, for Diana or aka Artemis, the virgin goddess of the hunt. Okay, so Paul writes that people who are strong in their faith can eat that meat, but people who are weak in their faith, who still struggle with whether or not those other gods are real, shouldn't eat the meat. And the issue is that, okay, who's going to fall into the category of strong in their faith and could eat the meat if they wanted to and wouldn't affect their faith? That's Jews, more likely. That's Jewish converts to Christianity. Whereas the Gentile converts who've lived their whole lives worshiping these gods are the ones who are going to be legally required to buy that meat, and that's the one that Paul demands not to eat the meat. So he's straight up telling people to break the law right there. So the reason I'm bringing this point up is because the whole scenario is one where if you just say you worship the Roman gods, you're free to go. Okay? And that's demonstrated through this idea of endurance that Polycarp and Paul talk about. It's demonstrated through the very word martyr becoming a thing. It seems odd that by the time you get very soon on, we got Ignatius and Polycarp getting martyred. And it's like, the story of the martyrdom of Polycarp is straight up one where you could recant and save your life. Maybe it was modified, but like, still though, when exactly, you know? But like, we'll talk about that in a minute. In addition to that, we've got the fact that the reason why they were being killed is one where recanting would get you off the hook. So I mean, those are three issues. And we got Pliny and Trajan literally writing that. You know, so like, let's look that up. When was Trajan emperor? So we type in Trajan. Okay. 98 to 117 AD. So that is right there. You know, given that Peter and Paul executed 64 to 67, and by that point the official way for dealing with Christianity was like, if they say that they worship the Roman gods, and that's good enough for us. And in the story of the martyrdom of Polycarp, it brings up an issue that becomes an issue in Christianity. Martyrdom was a big deal, and it was cool, and so you would have people who would volunteer to be martyred for their faith, even though no one had asked them to. And in the story of the martyrdom of Polycarp, you've got examples compare and contrasted. You've got this guy Germanicus who like endures it, and then you've got these other guy who like I forget his name. He comes and like volunteers because he wants like the fame of being a martyr, I guess. But then he wimps out and decides to worship the Roman gods. You know, there's a lot of stories like that. It becomes like very much a thing. And the Christians developed this idea that like martyrdom is a gift from God. You can't just decide to be a martyr just because you want to. The only reason that would develop as an issue within Christianity is because people were volunteering to be martyrs and then not actually going through with it. And it fits with this whole idea of endurance and the whole reason that they're being martyred in the first place. Yeah, and this is the difference between them and Joseph Smith. When you're Paul and you're Peter and you're right there and they're about to kill you and you're like, no, I still worship Jesus, that's totally different from taking two guys out in a Wild West shootout. Okay? So hopefully we, made that point. Oh, there's more to say. Paul actually gave up power. He gave up power. I didn't even talk about some of the violent persecutions. We got them in Thessalonica. We got it in Philippi. We know because Polycarp talks about it. But there's one more violent persecution along the way. As we said, Paul says that he violently persecuted Christians. He says it 3 times. He says it in Philippians. He says it in Galatians. And he says it in 1 Corinthians. Okay? And with the Galatians, he tells them he had a reputation for trying to destroy Christianity. So, it seems unlikely that the reputation he had would have been fake. It's a lot easier for him to lie. It's a lot harder for him to get a false reputation. And, the Galatians could have checked that out. He says other churches have heard, about this. So, it probably happened. Paul probably did persecute the Christians.